Last week, we talked about writing processes, and you submitted your first major project, the research proposal and annotated bibliography. This week, we're moving into introducing your second major project, the research paper. As you transition into working on the research paper from the proposal, it can be helpful to review some do's and don'ts of writing a longer paper. This is a lecture I do in an in-person 104, and my students there always give feedback saying this is one of the most useful things we go through, so hopefully you find it similarly helpful. You read a chapter from They Say, I Say this week about connecting the parts of your writing. This is key to reducing clunkiness in writing. When we think that writing flows or feels smooth, it's because the author is particularly adept at connecting the parts and transitioning from one idea into the next. Since you read about it, I won't regurgitate that information again here, but this image seems like a useful takeaway to think about. We want to reach forward and reach behind to tie our writing together. You want to make the ideas feel related to each other, and you should structure things in a way that lets your audience build on each of the previous ideas. We've talked about audience a number of times so far throughout this class because we know that research and rhetoric work together to create effective communication. Part of understanding your audience is knowing what their expectations are, plus actually meeting those expectations. So for something like a research paper, we know that generally the audience expects a certain structure when it comes to genre. Following a familiar structure lets them focus on what it is you're saying. When you depart from genre standards, your audience gets taken out of the experience of reading, and instead of focusing on what you're saying, they're focusing on how you're saying it. It can affect the level of credibility that they assign to you as an author, and it can affect whether or not they even choose to continue reading what you have to say. In a research paper, the genre expectations that we want to try to stick to include primarily structural elements. The audience will be looking for an introduction, a thesis, body paragraphs with topic sentences and transition sentences, and a conclusion. We'll go through how to write each of these parts as well as some other considerations. A paper should start off with an introduction. If we think about it rhetorically, introductions exist to grab the attention of your audience. It's a chance to let them know right off the bat what you're talking about and why it's important for them to read your writing. Within an introduction, there are a number of things that we should look to do and a number of things that we should try to avoid. Using a narrative opening or statistic can be influential to an audience as opposed to just starting with a fact like Ball State has 20,000 students. Your introduction will get much more interesting if you tell us why that's important. Like, Ball State has 20,000 students and they all seem to be loading onto a bus across campus at the same time, causing cramped transportation and even potentially unsafe situations. That way, the audience is understanding pretty quickly that you have beef with transportation services. Injecting a story of some kind helps to get them invested sooner. Like we said, introductions are the place where your audience starts to understand any necessary context or background information. This should be brief, but still enough to understand what's going on. Using hyper-specific vocabulary that your audience isn't familiar with or diving too deep into a particular concept detracts from what we're worried about in the introduction the most, right? The thesis. A thesis is necessary to include because without it, your audience is going to be lost. So the thesis is the first place where you're making your argument explicit to the reader. Because of this, we want it to be clear and concise. It comes towards the end of the introduction and it transitions into the body paragraphs. I once had a class where we were taught to write theses as a 3-part formula. You answered in sentence form the topic, the argument, and why the argument was important. I found this to be really restrictive because it was so formulaic, but if you tend to struggle with writing thesis statements, maybe that guide is useful for you. A thesis statement is based on your research question, so turn that into 1 or 2 sentences to make an argument. You've already made sure that it's open-ended and not just a statement of fact, so you'll also want to keep it that way at the end of the introduction. When it gets put other places, it can confuse the audience. And again, it makes them think about how you're writing instead of what you're writing. Next, we get into body paragraphs, and these are where your arguments get developed and you present evidence. They take your audience piece by piece through your claims that you're making in the thesis statement. And we're all familiar with this concept, but please, please, I beg of you, for the love of everything, please write actual paragraphs. Please. I cannot tell you how many research papers I have received that are walls of text with no paragraph break. Having paragraph breaks is incredibly important for your audience because it gives them a brief break in the reading. Body paragraphs in research papers generally should be somewhere between 5 and 10 sentences. This isn't a hard rule, but you want to generally aim for something around there. You'll also want to make sure that you cite your sources as standard in your field. Again, this is something that people seem to struggle with, so I recommend checking out Purdue OWL's website or making an appointment with the Writing Center to make sure that you're citing your sources correctly in text. Putting a link is not how you cite anything in text in any style of citation at all. If you're using quotes, you want to make sure that you're integrating them into your text using a quote sandwich, which you can learn more about in the other video lecture for this week. And besides evidence, the body paragraph is also made up of topic and transition sentences, both of which help your audience with connecting the parts like you read about. So topic sentences are the very first thing you read in a new body paragraph, and they orient your reader to what the paragraph is about, and they play into the connecting the parts goal that we have in an essay. To write effective topic sentences, a tip I always love is to make them mini arguments. That makes it so that your body paragraph feels like it has more of a purpose, right? You want to prove that claim that you're making at the beginning of the paragraph, as well as your overall claim in the thesis. This isn't always necessary for every single body paragraph, but I recommend aiming to have at least half, if not more, of your topic sentences arguments. Each paragraph should focus on one thing, and the topic sentence should subsequently be about one thing. If we start trying to throw too many things together, it can get confusing for our audience. We also don't want to make the topic sentence a quote. This is poor quoting practice, like the other video lecture for this week talks about, because we're not using a quote sandwich then. Your audience has no context about the quote. Bookending the paragraph, we have transition sentences. We start with topic sentences, we end with transition sentences. These sum up the paragraph that you just wrote, and they start to point to the next paragraph in the text. Again, transition sentences are a key element to making your writing feel like it's flowing. When we write a transition sentence, it's important to make it clear to the audience why this paragraph matters or how it feeds into your thesis overall. However, conclusion is important here too. We don't want our audience to drown in the in-between parts of our writing, so we need to move from one idea into the next using our transition words and phrases found in the reading for this week. And finally, we get to conclusions. So conclusions tend to be an area that students struggle with. It can be difficult because conclusions are where we're summing up the paper, but briefly. And when you've written 7 or 8 pages already, this can be a tall task. So you want to make sure that you cover your argument and key evidence, and you want the audience to have some sort of a takeaway, perhaps a call to action. We want to synthesize in the conclusion or show those broader connections, right? So what does it mean for Ball State if they don't lessen the number of credit hours or required core credit hours? What's the broader problem? What can the audience do about it? It's that ultimate moment of connecting the parts in your writing. It seems self-explanatory enough, but it is important that you actually include some sort of conclusion for your paper. So many people forget it, and when your paper ends so abruptly, it's jarring for the audience. Again, it takes them out of the experience of reading, and they're focused on the structure as opposed to the content of your writing. When you write your conclusion, try to avoid phrases at the beginning like, "in conclusion." These phrases are tired, they are outdated, and they are just plain boring. You are smarter and a better writer than that, right? There's something to be said for subtlety in writing, and in conclusion is not subtle. You'd be better off thinking of the beginning of the conclusion like a topic sentence, right? What kind of claim or point can you make about your argument? Something like, Ball State needs to start being more proactive about issues of accessibility on campus is going to be more effective than, in conclusion, Ball State has issues of accessibility on campus. The first one is stronger writing because it gives you something else to still prove, which you can do by summing up the evidence you've presented. I talk more about summarizing in the other video lecture for this week, so if you haven't yet, make sure that you give that a watch. As far as making connections go, there are plenty here. Identifying examples helps us to get to know different genres of writing more. Having a clear command of different genres of writing helps us to identify patterns in other types of writing and therefore write more effectively. And when we're thinking about writing in different genres, having a structure to follow may help us do things more effectively, or at least give us a better jumping off point. You're going to be in all sorts of different situations in the future, whether at school, at a job, or in your personal life, where being able to understand and match a genre will help you. It might be writing a cover letter for a job application, a lab report, a memo. You'll be in all sorts of writing situations and rhetorical situations that we can't anticipate exactly, but these skills of adapting to genres will help. Now that you have some of the do's and don'ts, you're more prepared to get into writing your research paper. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, you can post on the catch-all discussion board, set up an appointment with the Writing Center, or reach out to me.